to have been asked to chair this illustrated talk on Beethoven by Rohinton Nariman, a senior advocate in the Supreme Court. I have known Rohinton for many years, and I know his deep interest and knowledge of Western classical music. Although, when I first met him, it was because of our common love of opera. I do not wish to preempt the speaker of today's program, who will naturally give you all the necessary details about Beethoven's life. But perhaps I can mention a few ideas about his work as an introduction. Beethoven was born in 1770 and died in 1827. In other words, at the end of the 18th century and at the first half of the 19th century. He was thus the bridge between the so-called classical period in music and the Romantic period. The Romantic period in the 19th century was marked by the love of nature on the one hand and the fructification of music by the world of ideas in general. Both these aspects are to be found in his compositions. In a musical life spanning almost 40 years, he composed in almost all the existing genres, but was known especially for bringing the symphony, the piano sonata, and the string quartet to new heights. In his single opera, Fidelio, he introduced the ideas of the French Revolution of liberty, equality, and fraternity, combined with the virtues of conjugal love. In his symphonic works, he broke new ground by extending the form of the classical symphony as it's laid down by Haydn, to include voices in the final movement of the ninth. That is something that will also be shown and spoken about. The text of Schiller's Ode to Joy extols the ideals of the brotherhood of man. His piano sonatas, 32 in number, were composed during the course of his whole life. But it was the last one, Opus 111, which, as a musicologist has put it, is a hard aesthetic nut to crack. Opus 111 has been mentioned in many literary works in Germany, the most famous being Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, where a detailed exposition of the work is given. Both the last quartets as well as Opus 111 place huge musical demands on the performers and listeners alike. I'm sure that after listening to Rohinton, we shall be in a better position to understand and enjoy Beethoven's music. Thank you.
Just to trudge down Massachusetts Avenue, because I studied at the Harvard Law School, in order to go to the Symphony Hall, and I must have made about 20 such trips. One thing that struck me on the very first occasion was that at the very top center of the stage, there's a little golden heart with the words L. van Beethoven written there. It is only years later that I came to know that there was in fact a committee that had been appointed in 1900 when Symphony Hall was built. And the committee had to deliberate as to who, in their opinion, was the greatest ever composer, so that they could have his name up there in that little heart. We are not told what exactly moved the committee to ultimately arrive at Beethoven's name. There are other contenders who are certainly as great. Johann Sebastian Bach, for example, the father of music, as we know it, born in 1685, long before Beethoven, died in 1750. He really had very little before him, so in that sense he started out on a clean slate. And he actually brought music out of the church and into the secular world. That was his great contribution. Quite apart from the fact that he was remarkably prolific, composed over 200 hours of the music that is extant today with us. The other very strong contender would be Mozart, who was born in 1756 and died in 1791. he lived only 36 years. And in those 36 years, composed as much, if not more, than Johann Sebastian Bach. He was a child genius of a different order. At age 4, he began composing. At age 5, he actually wrote a piano concerto, which involves a separate part for the piano and separate parts for an entire orchestra. These things can't be explained. At age 14, on a trip to the Sistine Chapel, he actually heard an Italian composer, Allegri's Miserere. And this is a famous story. Allegri's Miserere was composed only for the church, and the Sistine Chapel musicians alone were entitled to play it. Nobody was entitled to get the score of Allegri's Miserere on pain of excommunication. Mozart decided he would get the score. How would he get the score? He'd attend the performance and write it out from memory. It's exactly what he did. And having done that, he only went to one other performance to see that every single one of the 9 parts, vocal parts, apart from the orchestral parts, were correctly written. Now, this man had a facility with composition which none before or after had. In fact, Carl Bohm, very great conductor, said it would have taken him 50 years to just sit down and copy out each extant work of Mozart. And Mozart did so many other things besides compose. What then, therefore, is there in Ludwig van Beethoven that committee felt would place him above these two gentlemen? I would only hazard a guess. And my guess is that there are 3 distinct musical periods in Beethoven's life. The first, the early period, is where distinct traces of both Haydn and Mozart are discernible. The second is where he breaks out into his own, the Beethoven we know. And the third is the phase when, in the last 7 years of his life, when he was stone deaf, especially through the late string quartets, he became a 20th century composer. It's an incredible thing that in one lifetime, this one man who lived for only 56 years actually spanned 2 centuries in terms of music. That, I think, is his greatest contribution to music, quite apart from the fact that he was known best as a symphonist. A little about Beethoven's birth. He was born on 16 December 1770 in Bonn and was christened Ludwig because his grandfather, Ludwig, happened to be the Kapellmeister there. He was quite a famous musician in his own right. His father, unfortunately, was a drunk and ill-treated little Ludwig, so much so that he didn't realize that the little boy was a genius in his own way. Every time he'd tell the little boy to stick to the written note. Don't keep wandering off into variations of your own, he would tell the little boy. He didn't realize that the boy was a genius until, of course, much later. His childhood was not a particularly happy one. He adored his mother, of course. He had 2 younger brothers. And he had a sibling called Ludwig, who was a year older than him, but who died in 6 days. He became a deputy organist to a person called Christian Gottlob Niefer at the age of 13 and played the organ and the viola with some facilities. Remarkable that in his later years he didn't compose much for either the organ or the viola. Perhaps his childhood left stains upon him which he did not wish to encounter in later life. It's only in the year 1787 that he makes his first trip to Vienna as a 17-year-old. By that time, of course, he had already composed 3 piano sonatas at the age of 12, 3 piano quartets at the age of 14, a piano concerto in E flat at the age of 14, and 2 early other piano sonatas. When he went to Vienna, there is that famous encounter with Mozart because he wanted to see the great Mozart. Fortunately, he was alive then. He died only in 1791. And we are told that what took place at that encounter was that Mozart asked him to play something and went into the next room. He wasn't at all impressed by what he heard. Then he came back and Beethoven started playing variations on that theme. That caught Mozart's ear. And Mozart immediately then told somebody else in the room, watch out for this boy, he's going to do something in future. He went back to Bonn and came back to Vienna only after his mother was dead. Mother died unfortunately in the year 1787. And he returned to Vienna in 1792, November 1792 to be exact. The same year in which the September massacres took place in the French Revolution. And when he settled in Vienna, the first thing that he did was to contact Franz Joseph Haydn, who after Mozart was the greatest living composer at the time. Haydn taught him composition and also taught him the refined playing of the piano, but for a very short period. Haydn was good to him, recommended him to various persons including the Esterházys, who were noblemen. But unfortunately, somewhere down the line something went wrong between Haydn and Beethoven. There are two incidents narrated. One is that he had by then composed the piano trios, 3 of them, which were published as opus number 1. The third trio, according to Beethoven, was the best of the 3. Haydn told him that, look, see that the first 2 trios are played before the Fickle Viennese is published. Don't play the third. And he told him because he realized that it would be a little in advance of its time and the Viennese public may not take to it. Beethoven took it the other way and thought that Haydn was jealous of it and therefore didn't want him to have that particular trio perform. So that unfortunately drove a wedge between the two of them. Apart from that, there is the other incident also, where Beethoven years later had composed a ballet called The Creatures of Prometheus, opus 43. Now, that is the only ballet that he ever composed. And Haydn was very pleased to have heard its first performance and complimented Beethoven. Beethoven immediately shot back. By then, of course, his relations with Haydn weren't exactly good. And shot back and said, yes, master, but it is not another creation. Haydn's creation, in inverted commas, was one of his most famous works, a great mass. So Haydn rather, in somewhat foul mood, then turned around and said, yes, perhaps it's not, and walked off. These are the two incidents narrated about his relations with Haydn, which unfortunately soured. Despite that, the first piano sonatas, opus 2, were dedicated by Beethoven to Haydn. The other teacher in those days was a man called Albrechtsberger. Now, this gentleman taught Beethoven the grammar of music, so to speak, and didn't teach him very much because, according to Beethoven in his later years, there wasn't very much that he learned from Albrechtsberger. His third teacher, interestingly enough, was Salieri. The very Salieri who was jealous of Mozart and who has been immortalized in that great picture, Amadeus. Salieri and Beethoven somehow got on well. And Salieri taught Beethoven for a period of about 10 years and taught him vocal composition. So much so that when he composed Fidelio, he went back to Salieri for certain tips. He dedicated his first 3 violin sonatas, opus 12, to Salieri. The early years in Vienna, from 1792 to about 1802, 10 years, were fantastic years for Beethoven. He was recognized as a young virtuoso pianist. He was indeed the best at that time, and an upcoming composer as well. In fact, he made trips to Prague, he made trips to Berlin, which were highly successful. In Berlin, he also composed the first 2 cello sonatas, opus 5, and dedicated them to King Frederick William II. But then, somehow, fate struck. And by 1801, he began to realize that he was getting increasingly deaf in both ears. And in 1802, a realization dawned upon him that this is only going to get worse. Now, if it is going to get worse and you are a performing pianist, out goes your bread and butter. So on 6th October 1802, he wrote what is called the famous Heiligenstadt Testament. It is a letter written to his two brothers, written in Heiligenstadt, which is in the 19th district in Vienna, where he was living at the time. That letter speaks for itself and tells you a great deal about this great genius's character. I have it here. And I wish to read it out to you in full, because this letter, more than anything else, reveals his character, reveals the greatness of the soul of the man. He says, "For my brothers Karl and Johann, O my fellow men who consider me or describe me as unfriendly, peevish, or even misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. For you do not know the secret reason why I appear to you to be so. Ever since my childhood, my heart and soul have been imbued with the tender feeling of goodwill. And I have always been ready to perform even great actions. But just think, for the last 6 years I have been afflicted with an incurable complaint which has been made worse by incompetent doctors. From year to year my hopes of being cured have gradually been shattered. And finally I have been forced to accept the prospect of a permanent infirmity, the curing of which may perhaps take years or may even prove to be impossible. Though endowed with a passionate and lively temperament, and even fond of the distractions offered by society, I was soon obliged to seclude myself and live in solitude. If at times I decided just to ignore my infirmity, alas, how cruelly was I then driven back by the intensified sad experience of my poor hearing. Yet I could not bring myself to say to people, speak up, shout, for I am deaf. Alas, how could I possibly refer to the impairing of a sense which in me should be more perfectly developed than in other people, a sense which at one time I possessed in the greatest perfection, even to a degree of perfection such as assuredly few in my profession possess or have ever possessed. Oh, I cannot do it, so forgive me. If you ever see me withdrawing from your company, which I used to enjoy. Moreover, my misfortune pains me doubly, inasmuch as it leads to my being misjudged. For me, there can be no relaxation in human society, no refined conversations, no mutual confidences. I must live quite alone and may creep into society only as often as sheer necessity demands. I must live like an outcast. If I appear in company, I am overcome by a burning anxiety, a fear that I am running the risk of letting people notice my condition. And that has been my experience during the last 6 months, which I have spent in the country. My sensible doctor, by suggesting that I should spare my hearing as much as possible, has more or less encouraged my present natural inclination. Though indeed, when carried away now and then by my instinctive desire for human society, I have let myself be tempted to seek it. But how humiliated I have felt if somebody standing beside me heard the sound of a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or if somebody heard a shepherd sing and again I heard nothing. Such experiences almost made me despair, and I was on the point of putting an end to my life. The only thing that held me back was my art. For indeed it seemed to me impossible to leave this world before I had produced all the works that I felt the urge to compose. And thus I have dragged on this miserable existence, a truly miserable existence, seeing that I have such a sensitive body that any fairly sudden change can plunge me from the best spirits into the worst of humors. Patience, that is the virtue, I am told, which I must now choose for my guide. And I now possess it. I hope that I shall persist in my resolve to endure to the end, until it pleases the inexorable Parse to cut the thread. Perhaps my condition will improve, perhaps not. At any rate, I am now resigned. At the early age of 28, I was obliged to become a philosopher, though this was not easy. For indeed, this is more difficult for an artist than for anyone else. Almighty God, who looked down into my innermost soul, you see into my heart, and you know that it is filled with love for humanity and a desire to do good. Oh, my fellow men, when someday you read this statement, remember that you have done me wrong, and let some unfortunate man derive comfort from the thought that he has found another equally unfortunate, who, notwithstanding all the obstacles imposed by nature, yet did everything in his power to be raised to the rank of noble artists and human beings. And you, my brothers, when I am dead, request on my behalf Professor Schmidt, if he is still living, to describe my disease and attach this written document to his record, so that after my death, at any rate, the world and I may be reconciled as far as possible. At the same time, I nominate you both heirs to my small property, if I may so describe it. Divide it honestly, live in harmony, help one another. You know that you have long ago been forgiven for the harm you did me. I again thank you, my brother Karl, in particular, for the affection you have shown me of late years. My wish is that you should have a better and more carefree existence than I have had. Urge your children to be virtuous, for virtue alone can make a man happy. Money cannot do this. I speak from experience. It was virtue that sustained me in my misery. It was thanks to virtue and also to my art that I did not put an end to my life by suicide. Farewell and love one another. I thank all my friends and especially Prince Lichnowsky and Professor Schmidt. I would like Prince Lichnowsky's instruments to be preserved by one of you, provided this does not lead to a quarrel between you. But as soon as they can serve a more useful purpose, just sell them. And how glad I shall be if in my grave I can still be of some use to you both. Well, that is all. Joyfully I go to meet death. Should it come before I have had an opportunity of developing all my artistic gifts, then, in spite of my hard fate, it would still come too soon. And no doubt I would like it to postpone its coming. Yet even so I should be content, for would it not free me from a condition of continual suffering? Come then, death, whenever you will, and with courage I will go to meet you. Farewell, and when I am dead, do not wholly forget me. I deserve to be remembered by you, since during my lifetime I have often thought of you and tried to make you happy. Be happy. This tells you much, much more about the man than I can tell you. What a character, what a lofty soul. The other great document, which is often spoken about, is the famous Immortal Beloved letter, which was written about 10 years after this, in 1812. That letter again is a passionate love letter and could have been written to any one of 5 or 6 ladies. Nobody is quite sure whom. It could have been written to either of the Brunswick sisters, Therese or Josephine. It could have been written to Giulietta Gicardi, to whom he dedicated his Moonlight Sonata. It could have been to Amélie Sebol, who was a soprano he was meeting at the time. It could have been any of these. Amélie Sebol perhaps is the one that ultimately fits the bill, but one doesn't really know. In 1805, fortunately for us, after this testament was written and Beethoven decided to live, masterpiece upon masterpiece followed in his middle period. The one thing that he worked on hardest was his beloved opera, Fidelio, which Professor Jain has spoken about. Fidelio was first called Leonora, for that is in fact the name of the wife who acts as a boy, Fidelio, so that she can join a particular jailer and save her husband, who was in solitary confinement, from an agonizing death. Leonora was performed in 1805 for the first time. Unfortunately, it didn't go off particularly well because Napoleon was in fact bombarding Vienna at the time. And Beethoven had already written one overture for it, Leonore number 1, which is his last published work in the opus numbers, opus 138, which was discarded at the first rehearsal itself. So it was never really performed in public. Leonore number 2, a completely different overture, was composed for the 1805 performance, which as I told you didn't go off well. In 1806, he had the second performance, for which he really composed his masterpiece, the Leonore number 3 overture. Again, the opera unfortunately did not go off well. It is only in 1814, many years later, when the name was changed from Leonora to Fidelio, and a separate overture was composed, which is the Fidelio overture, as we know it now, that the opera proved to be a success. There were, of course, many changes made by him. But unfortunately, and one can't understand why, the Leonore number 3 overture was scrapped and replaced by the Fidelio overture. It is only Gustav Mahler, the great conductor, apart from being a great composer, who in the beginning of the 20th century insisted on having Leonore number 3 played between acts 2 and 3, which is what is done often now in the Metropolitan Opera. A word about some of the other overtures that Beethoven wrote. He also wrote an overture, opus 62, to Coriolanus. Now Coriolanus was a Roman consul who lived in 500 BC, who had defected to the enemy and then re-defected to Rome because his mother and sister came out and begged and pleaded, and ultimately was put to death for having defected back to Rome. The overture is a brilliantly written work and actually ends with 3 notes showing you that Coriolanus' life after he is being stabbed is slowly ebbing away. The other famous overture he wrote was the overture to Egmont. Now Egmont was a creation of Goethe, who was the greatest writer in Germany at the time, and 20 years Beethoven's senior. There's an interesting anecdote about Goethe and Beethoven when they met. In fact, they used to go for walks together. And Goethe would keep doffing his cap to everybody who passed by, because you had the greatest literary man together with the greatest musical man walking together. After the third chap doffed his hat, Beethoven turned angrily to Goethe and said, "What are you doffing your hat for? They are doffing it for me, not for you." That also shows you how sure he was of himself. Now coming back to Egmont, which was one of Goethe's great creations. Egmont again is something very close, as Professor Jain told you, to Beethoven's revolutionary fervor, which is Egmont is a count in the Spanish Netherlands. He wants to throw off the yoke of Spain. And there is the cruel Duke of Alba who imprisons him and finally kills him. But his spirit doesn't cease, and it is his spirit ultimately that leads to the Spanish Netherlands independence. So Egmont is about that. Incidentally, the young Wagner was born in 1813. He heard this particular overture for the first time in 1828, a year after Beethoven died. He was then only 15 years old. And it was this stirring performance that led Wagner to become a composer. So Egmont then is the other great overture, together with incidental music, including Egmont's Love's Death, Clarchen's Death, opus 84. The other great overtures that he wrote, namely The Ruin of Athens, opus 113, and King Stephen, opus 117, were both written for the opening of a particular auditorium in Pest in Hungary. The Ruin of Athens is about Minerva, the goddess Minerva, coming out of a 2000 years sleep and suddenly landing up in Athens at the time that the Saracens had taken over during the Ottoman period, and being extremely distressed to find, instead of Greek temples all around, mosques all around. hence the appellation, ruin of Athens. King Stephen was the first king of Hungary, and the King Stephen Overture, therefore, was to recall his greatness, since you were opening a Hungarian auditorium, so to speak. The other overture is the overture Name Day, Opus 115, which was composed for what is called the name day of the emperor, that is the Austrian emperor. Incidentally, the Austrian emperor who lived in Vienna at the time of Beethoven was Francis. He was Francis the First, he was also Francis the Second. He was in fact the only emperor who happened to be an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and when that was dissolved by Napoleon, to be an emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after. So the Name Day overture therefore was for the emperor who Beethoven looked up to in Vienna itself. The very emperor who happened to be Marie-Louise's father, Napoleon's father-in-law. And the other last overture that he wrote is the overture Consecration of the House, Opus 124. I keep saying opus. The expression opus means published work. So it is published work number 124. And this was composed for the opening of the Josefstadt Theatre in Vienna in 1822. This again is a great work and is often performed today in concerts. So that gives you some idea of the overtures that Beethoven composed. Another interesting thing, somehow Beethoven and Napoleon's lives were intertwined. Both of them were born within a year of each other. Napoleon was born in 1769, Beethoven in 1770. Both were children of the revolution. Of course, Napoleon used the revolution. Beethoven continued to have the revolutionary fervor right till his last days. And there is the great story told of how he dedicated his third symphony, which is really a symphony which breaks with the past completely. The very first two hammer blows, tan, tan, show you that the old symphonic form has changed. There is no introduction now with the main theme. There are two hammer blows followed by a theme. He dedicated this work to Napoleon in 1803. That is before Napoleon became an emperor. At the time Napoleon was first consul. The moment he discovered that Napoleon had crowned himself on 2nd December 1804, he immediately scratched out the dedication, angrily. You can see that it's an angry scratch across the title page. And wrote instead, to the memory of a heroic man, because for him Napoleon was finished. In 1805, as I told you earlier, Napoleon was on the gates of Vienna, and that led to the collapse of Fidelio. And yet in 1808, King Jerome, who was Napoleon's youngest brother of Westphalia, sent Beethoven an offer which he could not really refuse at the time. He offered him 600 golden florins. At that point of time, that was a huge amount of money, in order to come and be Kapellmeister in Kürzen. Beethoven was very tempted to leave Vienna. Fortunately for us and for him, three princes got together and said that they would pay him an annuity of 4,000 gulden a year, which would ensure that he'd stay back in Vienna. And the three princes were Prince Lichnowsky, who you heard of in this Heiligenstadt Testament as being the person who had actually donated 4 instruments to Beethoven so that a quartet could be played there constantly. So you had Lichnowsky, then you had Lobkowitz, who was the dedicatee of the Eroica Symphony after Napoleon's name had been angrily sketched out, and the Archduke Rudolph. Now the Archduke Rudolph was somebody very important in Beethoven's life. He was actually the brother of the emperor, and he was his greatest patron. In fact, the largest number of all his major works were dedicated to the Archduke Rudolph, including a very famous work which is called the Archduke Trio, after Rudolph. In fact, the triple concerto that he wrote, Opus 56, which is for piano, violin and cello, has the piano part easy enough so that the Archduke Rudolph could play. So it is these three gentlemen who got together and, as I told you, saw to it that Beethoven did not leave Vienna. Strangely enough, in 1813, after Wellington won the Battle of Vittoria against King Joseph and completely destroyed the French power in Spain, because King Joseph had to flee thereafter, Beethoven wrote a potboiler of a work, it isn't a great work, of about 16 minutes, called Wellington's Victory at the Battle of Vittoria. Now this work was played along with the 7th Symphony, which is a really great work, in December 1813. Strangely enough, it is this potboiler of a work that led to Beethoven's being acknowledged as the greatest living composer of his time. And it's from 1813 onwards that he didn't really look back. This again, thanks ultimately to a Napoleonic war. And then we come to the famous Congress of Vienna in 1815, where Metternich and others plotted and schemed to see that the great Prometheus, Napoleon, would be chained to his rock in St. Helena. And for that also, Beethoven hurriedly put together a work, which is a cantata, which is called The Glorious Moment, Opus 136. Beethoven's later life, unfortunately, was not a very happy one. As I told you, his deafness got to a point where he became stone deaf after about 1822. For his last 5 years, he was stone deaf. And he had those famous conversation books, so that if somebody ever came in to speak to him, he could only write to him and he'd write back. Rossini was one such, the famous Italian composer, who visited Beethoven in 1822. And Beethoven is supposed to have told him through the conversation book that you chaps are good only at opera buffa, stick to opera buffa, do nothing else. Other great people met him as well. Weber met him and performed Fidelio at Dresden. Schubert met him once but was too shy to go and meet him again. And you have that very unfortunate incident of his nephew Karl attempting suicide. Beethoven must have been a very difficult character to live with. He was howling, stamping, doing all sorts of crazy things because there was so much going on in his mind while composing. He didn't have much time for poor Karl. Fortunately for Beethoven, Karl, who wanted to end his life, succeeded only in grazing his skull. Nothing really happened to him ultimately. Karl in turn, after Beethoven died, married, produced a son, called him Ludwig. Ludwig in turn produced a son, called him Karl, who was the last lineal descendant of Beethoven, who died in 1917. There's the other famous incident of the first performance of the great Ninth Symphony, which all of you have heard of, and which Professor Jain spoke about. There again something very piquant took place. The master, as he was then called, was stone deaf. He got up to conduct the work, was much faster than the orchestra. The result was a ludicrous one. In fact, fortunately, the orchestra followed the first violin, who was Schuppanzig at the time. And Beethoven would crouch down at the soft, what he thought were the soft passages, when in fact the orchestra was playing fortissimo, and finished much earlier. And unfortunately couldn't hear the deafening applause. He was stone deaf. Now this is where there are two stories. One told by Thalberg, who was a famous pianist who attended that performance, and who said that Caroline Unger, that is the contralto who sang the contralto part, had to actually turn him round for him to see the audience. But she turned him round after the scherzo, which is the second movement. His biographer Schindler and Caroline Unger, on the other hand, said that he was turned around after the entire performance. Finally, his last days were very painful, apparently he suffered from dropsy. But they were lightened by two things that happened. One was that the entire edition of Handel's works were sent to him. Incidentally, Beethoven thought that Handel was the greatest ever composer. And he thought that Handel was the greatest ever composer only because, according to Beethoven, he could build monumental structures out of very simple bricks. So he was very happy to receive on his deathbed or introduction then on Beethoven. The latter part of this speech will now be snippets from various works of Beethoven. What I have done really is this. We begin with each genre of music. We begin with the piano sonatas, which I will introduce to you, and then play a snippet from one of them, because there isn't time here. Carry on to the violin sonatas, etc., until we come to the symphonies, and then end with the Missa Solemnis. Now, so far as the piano sonatas are concerned, they are again a fantastic body of work. There are 32 of them, 32 published works. There happen to be 3 early piano sonatas which are unpublished and which are delightful. They were composed only when he was 12 years old. As I told you earlier, the Opus 2 3 piano sonatas were dedicated to Haydn, his first teacher. And fortunately for us, we have the piano sonatas in each distinct period of his musical creativity. We have the early sonatas, we have the middle sonatas, and we have the late sonatas. Incidentally, the most famous of these sonatas were somehow or the other given some title. The 2 titles that Beethoven himself gave his sonatas were pathetic to the piano sonata number 8 because of the second, the slow movement, and Les Adieux to the piano sonata number 26. Les Adieux because in 1809, as I told you earlier, Napoleon had bombarded Vienna. The royal family had to leave. The first movement, therefore, is about their leaving Vienna. The second movement is about their being out of Vienna. And the third movement is about their return. So apart from these 2 names, the other famous names were given by publishers. For example, you have the Funeral March Sonata, which is sonata number 12, because of its second slow movement. The slow movement sounds like a funeral dirge. You have the Pastoral Sonata, number 15, because of its opening. It's obvious that there are birds chirping and you are in nature. You have the Tempest Sonata, opus 17, number 17, which again, because of its opening, sounds like a storm and then carries on to better weather. You have the Hunt Sonata, number 18. You have the Waldstein Sonata, number 21. Now, Waldstein is important because Count Waldstein was one of the few persons who was very good to Beethoven in Bonn, that is before he moved to Vienna. In fact, when Beethoven left in November 1792 for Vienna, it is Waldstein's very famous statement that he made, which is, "May you go to Vienna and receive the spirit of Mozart through Haydn's hand." So the Waldstein Sonata again marks the beginning now of the later piano sonata. The Appassionata number 23 was dedicated to the brother of the 2 Brunswick sisters. The Les Adieux, as I told you, is 26. And we come to the Hammer Clavier, which is 29, a snippet of which I am going to play you just now, which was considered in its time to be one of the most difficult sonatas to play, and was composed together with the late quartets, the 9th Symphony, and the Missa Solemnis. So it's a very late work. And the last 3 sonatas, of course, are late works and very great works. The 32nd sonata, which was spoken about by Professor Jain, is in only 2 movements. The second movement is one of the most beautiful movements ever in piano sonata history. Unfortunately, we don't have time for all this. But may I now begin with the first snippet, which is a snippet from the Hammer Clavier, the sonata number 29, which is a very difficult sonata to play. It's played here by Alfred Brendel. told you earlier, the very first 3 violin sonatas, opus 12, were dedicated to his teacher, Salieri. You then have numbers 4 and 5, opus 23 and 24, 5 being famous because it's called the spring sonata, because you have sounds in it which evoke spring to the ear. Then you have 3 sonatas, all published together as opus 31, 2 and 3, which were all dedicated, strangely enough at that time, to Emperor Alexander I of Russia. And then you move on to the famous Kreutzer Sonata, number 9. Now, the Kreutzer Sonata was composed at a time when a mulatto violinist from England called George Bridgetower came to Vienna. Bridgetower apparently wanted some new work of Beethoven's so that he could show off his musical skills. Beethoven quickly wrote the Kreutzer Sonata, and their first performance was in 1803 together. Unfortunately, thereafter, Bridgetower and Beethoven fell out, and the original dedicatee, therefore, was now changed to the famous Rudolf Kreutzer, who was one of the most famous violinists of his day, living in Paris. Rudolf Kreutzer never ever played the sonata, even though it was dedicated to it, saying it was too difficult. The only other person I can think of to whom some piece was dedicated and who did not play it was Joseph Joachim, who was a very famous violinist in his day. The Schumann Violin Concerto was dedicated to it. He didn't play it because he thought that Schumann was off his rocker by then. Unfortunately, Schumann died in an asylum. A very strange story then ensues. Joachim's great niece was a lady called Jelly Darani, who was also a very great violinist. She also happened to be a medium. In a particular seance in 1931, a spirit came to her and said, "I have been wronged." She asked the name of the spirit. It was Robert Schumann. Schumann came and visited her and said, "Look, I have been wrong. There is this violin concerto dedicated to your great uncle. It must be ferreted out and performed." People looked for it and ultimately found it in the Berlin archives. Fortunately, Joachim had left it with his papers to his son, and his son had donated it to the Berlin archive. They were then pulled out of the Berlin archives, and the Schumann Violin Concerto was then given its first performance in 1937 in Berlin. But coming back now to the Kreutzer, this extremely great violin, it's the greatest of the 10 violin sonatas, is the only violin sonata out of the 10 where in fact the violin starts and shows that now it is a superior part. In fact, Beethoven wrote for all his piano sonatas or violin sonatas, sonata for piano and violin, not the other way around. It's only in the Kreutzer that the violin really begins. The 10th sonata, which is opus 96, Kreutzer is 47, so a big leap, 10-year leap, was written again for a famous French violinist called Pierre Rode. Pierre Rode played its first performance with the Archduke Rudolph. And apparently by that time he was way beyond his performing capabilities. So now, a small snippet from the Kreutzer Sonata with Nathan Milstein playing. The first two were very early works. They were published as Opus 5 and they were dedicated to Frederick William II, who was the ruler at that time in Berlin. The third sonata, which I am going to play for you, Opus 69, is the most beautiful of the three. And it was dedicated to a friend called Baron Gleichenstein. In fact, Beethoven fell desperately in love with his sister-in-law, Therese Malfatti, proposed marriage to her and was turned down by her. This sonata is an extremely lyrical and beautiful one and is played by none other than the great Russian duo, Rostropovich and Richter. Rostropovich, I'm very sorry to tell you, died last week. So I'll play you a snippet from it. And then you have the last two cello sonatas, Opus 102, which are part of the later period and which, strangely enough, were dedicated not to a cellist but to a pianist. And they were finally played by that pianist, and Joseph Link, who was one of the great cellists of his day. Now please see a snippet from the cello sonata number 3 in A major, Opus 16. String trios, which are very early works, Opus 3 and Opus 9, delightful work. And 7 piano trios. The last of these piano trios is called the Archduke because, as I told you, it was dedicated to Archduke Rudolph. It's the most famous of the 7. The first 3 piano trios, which were in fact the first published works of Beethoven, were dedicated to Karl Lichnowsky, who was a prince. Now, Lichnowsky had been extremely good to Mozart before Beethoven, and in turn was exceptionally good to Beethoven as well. Unfortunately, Beethoven's tempestuous nature got the better of it, and at once, please don't forget that you are born a prince and there are 1,000 other princes, but there will be only one Beethoven. Here now, the Archduke trio, which is on a CD, so you won't see anything here. It's played by Isaac Stern, Leonard Rose, and Eugene Istomin. cello. He composed 6 quartets and published them together as Opus 18, early works. He probably put 6 together and composed them and published them together for the reason that Mozart had before him dedicated 6 quartets to Haydn. They are among Mozart's greatest works. In fact, Mozart in a letter to Haydn says, "These are my sons, they are my children, which I am dedicating to you." And Haydn, on hearing them, is supposed to have told Mozart's father, Leopold Mozart, that upon my honor, and I am an honorable man, your son is the greatest living composer today. Beethoven obviously was greatly taken up by the string quartet medium because of this. And the early string quartets display youthfulness, freshness, beauty. We move on now to the famous Razumovsky quartets. Count Razumovsky happened to be the Russian ambassador in Vienna at the time, and the brother-in-law of Prince Lobkowitz, who was another great patron of Beethoven. He commissioned, and Beethoven therefore dedicated 3 middle period quartets, numbers 7, 8 and 9, which are exceptionally beautiful, all published as Opus 59, 1, 2 and 3, to Count Razumovsky. Numbers 10 and 11 are the harp, Opus 74, and 11 is the Sirius, so called because there is a plucking of strings which makes it sound like a harp in the harp quartet, and the Sirius because it reflects a very somber and difficult period of Beethoven's time. It is after the 11th quartet that Beethoven becomes a 20th century composer. Prince Galipzin, that is again a Russian emigrant, specifically ordered 3 quartets from Beethoven. And ultimately, the 3 that were dedicated to him were the Opus 127, 130 and 132. These are the first late quartets, so to speak, which really take a leap over everything that is romantic and 19th century and go straight into the 20th century. He also composed his famous C-sharp minor quartet, number 14, Opus 131. It's the most famous really of the 16 quartets. And somehow or the other dedicated it to one of the most banal personalities of the time, some gentleman called Stutterheim. Now Stutterheim apparently had got his nephew Karl into the army, so I suppose in recompense this great work was just dashed off for Stutterheim. And then you had quartets 15 and 16, and above all the great Grosse Fuge. Now the Grosse Fuge was in fact the last movement of the B-flat major quartet, Opus 130. His friends told him that, look, this doesn't somehow gel with what has gone before. Publish it separately on its own. And Beethoven did exactly that. And of course, with equal facility and speed, composed a 6th movement, totally different movement, for the Opus 130 quartet. I will now be playing a snippet of the last quartet, the 16th quartet, 3rd movement. And it will be performed here by the Amadeus Quartet. impromptu combinations for 5 instruments, 6 instruments. They are not very distinguished works. You have 3 string quintets. In fact, 2 are arrangements of other works. You have a piano quintet, which is an early work, opus 16. You have 2 sextets, that is again for 6 instruments. One is wind, one is strings. Not very distinguished works. But the work that he composed for 7 instruments, the septet, was an early work, published as opus 20. And was a work apparently that delighted audiences in its time. Beethoven got fed up of it and wanted in fact to disclaim that he ever wrote it. But it is a very, very beautiful work, and there is a snippet of it. Violin, viola, cello, double bass, French horn, bassoon, clarinet. Concertos again belong to the early and middle period. In fact, the piano concerto, which is published as number 1, opus 15, is in fact the second concerto. Both are early and beautiful works, opus 15 and opus 19. But Beethoven really comes into his own with the third concerto, the C minor concerto, which was published as opus 37. It is after this that you then have the next 2, which are outstanding works. The 4th piano concerto, the G major, opus 58, is my particular favorite. And then of course, the famous Emperor concerto, which is the 5th and last of the piano concertos, opus 73. Apparently it got its name Emperor many, many years after its first performance. Nobody quite knows how. But obviously the person who named it thought that it was the emperor among piano concertos. The violin concerto, again, I must tell you that there are sketches for a very early violin concerto which were written by Beethoven when he was in Bonn. So he obviously had a violin concerto on his mind. But the particular violin concerto, which ultimately he dedicated to his old friend Stefan van Breuning, he really composed for a man called Franz Clement. Now Clement happened at that time to be a leader of an orchestra and a brilliant violin player. So it was really composed for him, dedicated to Breuning. It's an exceptionally beautiful work. Probably the emperor among violin concertos, all violin concertos. And What is fabulous about it is that it is harmonious and very, very musical. There isn't much time, otherwise one could have played the first movement itself. But then it takes the violin some time to get it. So I have chosen instead the beginning of the third movement and then the beginning of the Emperor Concerto. It's now the beginning of the Emperor Concerto. Napoleon, that we now find a completely different art form. I told you earlier, there are those famous two hammer blows which signify that there is now a radical departure from the old symphony form. It is true that the odd number symphonies, that is 3, 5, 7 and 9, which have been described as the forceful masculine symphonies, are different from the even number symphonies, which are more temperate and therefore called feminine, that is 4, 6 and 8. The third symphony is really the heralding in of a new era. It was composed in 1803, fortunately, after Beethoven decided not to take his life. It has 4 movements. The first movement is the powerful hammer blows followed with the main theme. The second movement is the famous funeral march movement, which is often played whenever a great musical personality passes away. The third movement is the scherzo, and the fourth movement is the movement that contains the famous Eroica theme. Now, interestingly enough, this Eroica theme is to be found in three other Beethoven compositions, the same thing. It originates in some early German dances, which are works without opus, W008. It's the 7th out of 12 dances. It finds itself again in the Eroica variations, opus 35. It begins with this theme and then these variations carry on for piano solo. And it finds its way into the finale of the Creatures of Prometheus, which is the only ballet that Beethoven ever wrote. Apart from three, the fourth is a delightful symphony. It was described by Robert Schumann as being a slender Grecian maiden between two Norse giants. The fifth, the other Norse giant, is Fate knocking at the door, the famous pa-pa-pa-pam, pa-pa-pa-pam. It shows you how Beethoven was the master of the variation. There's no real thematic or harmonic material as much as there is variation upon variation upon variation. The sixth is the great pastoral symphony, which evokes scenes from nature, including being by a brook, enduring a storm, and after the storm, everything calming down again. The seventh symphony, again, is a beautiful symphony and was published immediately before the eighth. It has a second movement which is perhaps one of the greatest movements in symphonic literature. And like Beethoven's great idol, Handel, Beethoven composed this second movement, which he marked allegretto, from the same note being played 12 times. Tung, 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 12 times, until the main theme begins. So, a massive, beautiful structure built from very simple material. I'm going to play it for you. First on the piano, then to show you that it's that one note hit 12 times. And then with Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic Symphony. Unfortunately, it was dwarfed by the seventh. Beethoven was very defensive about it and insisting it was a better symphony than the seventh. I'm not so sure. Neither are musicologists. The ninth, of course, is the magnum opus. And the ninth symphony contains, as all of you know, the great poet Schiller's Ode to Joy, which was one of the things very dear to Beethoven's heart, which is brotherhood, universal brotherhood among all men. And that's why on every New Year's Eve, in Japan particularly, they play the Ninth Symphony. Apart from these great works, of course there is the Missa Solemnis, which is the sister work of the Ninth Symphony. Beethoven considered it his greatest work. I tend to agree. It is a mass written for voices and orchestra, dedicated to Archduke Rudolph. In fact, it was supposed to have been written for Archduke Rudolph's becoming Archbishop of Olmutz in 1820. It wasn't completed until 3 years later. And strangely enough, it got its first performance in St. Petersburg, not in Vienna, by the same Prince Galitzin, who had commissioned the last three string quartets. The other great work I can think of offhand, which was commissioned but not played in the country of its birth, is the Tchaikovsky, famous Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto No. 1, which was dedicated to Nicholas Rubinstein. Rubinstein, of course, didn't play it. And as a result, it got its first performance in Boston in 1875 with Hans von Bülow at the piano. But coming back to the symphonies, I have for you first snippets from the third symphony, the Eroica, followed by the Eroica theme played out, both in Prometheus and in the variations. Then the 7th symphony played out first on the piano by Katsaris, then with the orchestra, and finally snippets from the last movement of the ninth. Enjoy. Eroica theme. The same theme. Second movement. The same note played 12 times. Now it changes. And now the symphonic version. As each theme comes, I shall tell you. The opening of Schirer's Ode to Joy is by the double basses. After that, a bass baritone then takes over, sings it, then the chorus takes over, and finally there is the finale. So, unfortunately, we can't have the whole movement because there's no time. I have taken these 4 snippets. From the first movement. snippet will be from the great Misa Solemnis. This is the third passage, Sanctus, which means holy. Juxtaposing two pieces, one a very early piece and one a very late piece, to show you why I think that this was perhaps the greatest ever living composer. There will be a snippet from the E-flat piano concerto which he wrote when he was a young boy of 14. And finally, we will end with the Grosser Fugue, which, as I told you earlier, was the most abstruse and difficult composition in its time for string quartet. First the E-flat concerto, followed by the Grosser Fugue. into complex dissonance. Thank you very much.
Rohinton, for this brilliant and erudite lecture on Beethoven, the man and his works. You've been able to show how the development of his music has taken place through all the basic genres in which he composed, starting with the piano sonatas, right up through to his symphonies, to his Missa Solemnis, his great choral work. I think that we can take back with us, after this lecture, so much that we would like to naturally get to know more about Beethoven and his works as a result of the snippets, which of course I think has whetted our appetites for more. And I'm sure that a lot of us now will go back and go to the record shops and try and find some more of the music that we've heard only in short pieces and which we would like to naturally get to know absolutely in its entirety.
I think you're all tired now. I don't mind fielding questions. But
actually, I must admit that after such a brilliant talk, I am totally speechless. But in any case, I'm sure if there are any questions, I'm sure Mr. Nariman will be only too happy to answer them. Please.
Not really. Most of them were dedications to persons who deserved the dedication because they were Viennese nobility who helped musicians. For example, Lichnowsky, Lobkowitz, Razumovsky, all these people actually helped Viennese musicians. The only undeserved dedication that I could often think of was that Baron Stutterheim, which the 14th quartet was dedicated.
Any other questions? Any other comments?
I read somewhere some time back that Hitler liked Beethoven's music particularly.
Hitler liked?
Beethoven's compositions particularly.
He liked Wagner's music particularly.
Oh, not very.
Anyone else? Then I would like